All-Star Game at an estimated cost of $100 million in economic activity and thousands of jobs for Georgia's residents. On March 8th, when describing the Georgia election law, you called it Jim Crow and a suit and tie. On March 10th, well before the Georgia election law was passed, you registered the website stopjimcrow2.com. On March 14th, you called the Georgia election bill a redux of Jim Crow. On March 25th, the bill passed into law. On March 31st, you wrote an op-ed in the USA Today about Georgia's law, and your first two words in that op-ed were, boycotts work. 2 days later, on April 2nd, Major League Baseball announced its boycott of Georgia. According to media reports in the days leading up to Major League Baseball's decision to pull the All-Star Game from Georgia, you spoke with baseball executives, you described the law as Jim Crow 2.0, and you urged Major League Baseball to speak out. But after its decision to withdraw the game from Georgia, you conveniently claimed that you had strongly urged them not to boycott after the horse was out of the barn and the damage was already done. So, Ms. Abrams, in sum, you publicly attacked the Georgia law as Jim Crow no fewer than 10 times before Major League Baseball withdrew the game. You told corporations that boycotts work, and you told corporations that if they don't attack Georgia's law, quote, I cannot argue with an individual's choice to opt out for their competition, end quote. Ms. Abrams, after all these efforts to smear Georgia as a Jim Crow state, do you regret your central role in causing Major League Baseball to withdraw the All-Star Game from Georgia?
First, Senator, I would not call Georgia a Jim Crow state. I would say that SB 202 is a law that has Jim Crow aspects, and I stand by that characterization because we have, I think, to great detail and great effect explained today why that is so. I also, in line 2 of that same op-ed, I acknowledge that boycotts work because as the progeny of those who used boycotts to gain access to the very rights we are fighting to defend, I recognize the utility of boycotts. However, I took a great deal of effort to explain why I do not think a boycott in Georgia at this time is the appropriate remedy. But I believe it is important to preserve all civil disobedience rights when you seek to achieve the outcome of justice and access in the United States. Number 3, I would say that my conversations with Major League Baseball were very clear about the fact that I did not think a boycott was necessary. I was very intentional about my language. I continue to be intentional about my language. And while I am not the commissioner of baseball, I'm not the head of a corporation, I am a Georgia citizen, and I have every right and responsibility to speak out against laws that will have an effect on my community. And yes, while I certainly regret the decision that MLB made to remove their game from Cobb County and the economic effect that it will have on Georgians writ large, I support anyone who will try to stop this type of bad behavior, this type of racial animus, this type of voter suppression from happening in Georgia or elsewhere in the country, because to me, one day of games is not worth losing our democracy.
Thank you, Ms. Abrams. After you spent weeks condemning your legislature for passing Jim Crow laws and telling corporations boycotts work, I doubt that your words are going to be very comforting to the thousands of Georgians who will lose their jobs, will have their livelihood affected by Major League Baseball's decision. I want to turn now to Secretary Bill Gardner. I want to stress again that he's been in office since 1976, longer than 3 members of this committee have been alive. Back in the Army, we had a term for grizzled soldiers who had been in combat repeatedly, not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but sometimes Mogadishu or Panama, or I even served with one guy that jumped into Grenada in 1983. They were called been there and done that. If anyone has been there and done that when it comes to election laws, it is Bill Gardner. You have repeatedly, over decades, reviewed election laws. You see what is before the Congress now in the For the People Act with its sweeping reforms. What do you think this federalization of our state-based election system would do to your elections in New Hampshire, Secretary Gardner?
Senator, it would be harmful to our elections in New Hampshire. I go back when the FECA, Federal Election Campaign Act, originally passed, and there was a threshold. States that met the threshold weren't going to be affected by it. And then within 2 years, states were completely taken out of that. We no longer could control the rules for the election of our U.S. senators and House members. Then we went to the National Voter Registration Act in '93. And that act, people of New Hampshire, the local officials, wanted voter registration to be an in-person process. And the only way to maintain that in-person process was if we became exempt from the National Voter Registration Act. And so we passed legislation, made it retroactive to the effective date of that act. That was the only way to get exempt, so that we could keep our election process the way New Hampshire wanted it. And we were sued, not by anyone from New Hampshire, because both parties were agreeable then, but from some organization in New York City. And we ended up, the federal government gave an exemption to us so that we no longer had to comply with NVRA. That's made all the difference. If you look at the chart, you can see what happened in New Hampshire starting in 1996, the first time a presidential election happened after the National Voter Registration Act. And New Hampshire, from that point on, has been at the top of the country because we don't allow people to register by mail unless they're absent, they're out of town or out of the city, or they're disabled. We have our rules that we've applied all these years, and you can see what it has resulted. 4 presidential elections in a row, 3rd highest in the country. The one before that, 5, we were 4th in the country. Now you can go back, you can see from those charts. So then we went to the Help America Vote Act. Well, we became exempt from parts of NVRA because we were exempt from NVRA, we didn't have to comply with the Help America Vote Act. We don't have provisional ballots in New Hampshire. We're one of 4 states in the country that doesn't have provisional ballots. So we've gone our way that has worked for the people of New Hampshire. The proof is in the pudding, the turnout. And it's the same with this. Now they want to, if you were to pass this, you're completely taking away a process that has developed in New Hampshire for many, many years, works in the state. Why would you want to do it when the turnout is as high as it is? And it's, as I'm listening to all this, it's a pretty sad story in a way, because you have the state of Georgia. There's a New England state, Rhode Island, that actually had a lower turnout in 2020 than Georgia. But states have different ways of doing it that works. That's why I said at the beginning, I don't want Texas to have to be like New Hampshire or Arkansas or California, but why should we be made to be like California in particular, or other states? We have a way of doing it that works for the people of New Hampshire. The turnout is the proof that it works. And this kind of federal legislation is harmful for our way of voting.
Thank you,
And
Mr. Gardner. I
it's not-
appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Booker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Stacey Abrams, I'd like to direct